Welcome back. I'm Gregory Love. I teach Christian systematic theology here at San Francisco Seminary in San Anselmo, California. And we're doing a series on the relationship between God and this COVID virus and the pandemic, which is causing human suffering. What is God's relationship to the pandemic? We're looking at 4 different Christian answers to that question. The first one we looked at imagines God as a governor, planning and ruling over all things, including nature and history and the smallest details of our lives. The 4 reasons why this governor may bring suffering upon us are these: for some part of God's secret plan that we don't know, or as punishment for sin, or as a teaching tool, or maybe to help a third party, somebody else. Now, today's second model takes the third of those 4 reasons, suffering as a tool to help us grow, and expands it into its own separate model. This model is equally as classic as that first model. These are the 2 traditional answers to the Christian question, answer to why bad things happen to good people. Now, it is clear why this model becomes its own separate model and is so important. All the world religions say we're not who we should be, morally or spiritually. Each religion imagines a way for humans to move from that imperfection toward perfection. They all think we can grow and we should grow. And so with this second model, it imagines God as an artist who shapes humans into something beautiful. Now, this view is found not only in every world religion, but also in every version. In other words, in the liberal, the moderate, and the conservative versions of these religions. Now, to look at this model, we're going to start with one perspective. We're going to take a look at the liberal view, since it's got a very clear example. And to do it, we're going to look at one of the 2 best books on this second model from the 20th century by philosophical theologian John Hick. The book is Evil and the God of Love. Now, John Hick begins by offering an alternative to the Augustinian fall story, which is, that story begins with the idea that we start in paradise in Eden in Genesis 1, everything's perfect, we're perfect, and then we ate from the tree that was disallowed, and we fell into sin, and the world became imperfect. That's not what John Hick thinks. He thinks that God created human beings for fellowship, for relationship of love with God and with one another. But for God to get this goal, several things are needed, even for the omnipotent God. First, the goal demands that God put us in a world in which God is not obvious. Okay, I'm gonna write this down. God made sure that God is not completely obvious in this world. In other words, God's presence and existence are hidden. Right? Now, why? Well, God is an eternal, omnipotent, magnificent being. And if God's presence before us were obvious, we would feel obligated to worship such a magnificent, overwhelming being. So instead, God backs away and puts us on this earth in situations where it's not clear whether God exists or not, right? And it's a good thing that God does this from this perspective. So, how did God do it? God, who is a spiritual being, did this hiddenness by creating physicality. God makes a physical world one that runs according to natural laws, chance, and human free will. In such a world, where we see the laws and we see chance events, but not necessarily do we see God, we're then free to make up our own choice about God, about whether we want or do not want a relationship with this God. So, already in this model, we know something about why bad things happen. Let me fill this in a bit more. You remember that the physical... In this view, the world runs according to natural laws, chance, and human free will. Well, what that means is accidents can happen. Why? Because God is not controlling everything that happens. Right? The physical processes of the world that God made runs how things work. Now, this view of how God makes the world fits what science knows. The Big Bang, evolution, ecosystems in nature, and it also fits what science knows about viruses. Sometimes in the newspaper or in our discussions, we talk as if the virus is some kind of absolute evil or enemy. But what biologists and scientists know is that viruses are so amazingly common, and they actually can have very positive influences on maintaining ecosystems and biological life in this world. In other words, it is not true to say the world would be better off if there were no viruses. That's not true, according to science. Now, second, what else does God need to get that goal of a fellowship of love? The goal demands that God makes us as imperfect and puts us in a challenging, stimulating environment. Okay? So God makes imperfect humans and puts them in an imperfect world. We're not perfect beings, and this is not Eden. Now, once again, that fits what science knows about us and our world. Early humans lived in a violent and dangerous world, and they themselves were violent, and they were naturally selfish. However, they also had the potential to learn, to become loving, and to change their view of God. So they're created imperfect in an imperfect, challenging world, but with the potential to become perfect. Early humans lived in a world filled with challenges to their moral, social, and spiritual character. Now, what that meant was, for us humans, we could freely choose our path when the road divided. In other words, we could choose virtue or vice. This world of natural laws and chance that's indifferent to us provides those moral forks in the road which give us choices about faith or no faith, love or no love. What kind of world is that? Well, cars skid off the road according to the law of physics. Water drowns people. Diseases spread, and they do so indifferent to the lives they affect. It's precisely in such situations as these that the fork in the road appears, and we can choose faith and trust in God and trust in our neighbor, or we can choose mistrust of God and selfishness, just like Ebenezer Scrooge did every time he walked through his city and ignored the poor who needed his help. So, if God is all-powerful and loves us like a mother loves her own child, why is there evil? In this second model, evil happens because of a physical world that runs on its own laws and provides just the right environment for us to grow spiritually and morally. In this world, earthquakes and floods happen, and the human body is vulnerable to illness and anxiety. Natural disasters strike by chance. There's no rhyme or reason. And humans, they can be evil. God does not intend any of these particular disasters to fall upon us or upon any particular individual. So God is not wanting this pandemic to come up and affect this person or that person. That's not God's doing. You can already feel the difference from that first model there. However, God does intend a physical world of natural laws and chance and human free will in which such disasters are possible. Because this world makes human free will possible, and thus it's going to help God's goal of humans who grow up and are capable of love. Now, this model needs one more piece for it to work. It needs an afterlife, a belief in an afterlife. The reason is because most people will not finish their growth into fully loving human beings in this lifetime. Most of us won't get the job fully done. So in the afterlife, we can finish that process of growing into somebody who loves God and loves their neighbor as themselves. So, God is in the business of crafting souls, but God must engage humans with their free will to make those souls. This view, it's present, as I said, in liberal and moderate and conservative religious forms. In general, the liberal forms see God as allowing natural laws and chance and human free will to take their course, as we saw with John Hick. Right? In other words, we learn simply because the events appear by chance and by natural laws. Now, the conservative form of this soul-making model believes that God causes the particular challenging events so that we have opportunities to grow. So in other words, God acts to bring about these events of challenge so that we have a chance to make a choice at the fork. Now, the most significant book on this model in the 20th century is by C.S. Lewis. It's called The Problem of Pain. And he wrote it in 1940 when the bombs were being dropped on London. Here's what he says in this famous book. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So pain is needed to wake us up from our delusions and get us to turn back to God. You can feel that idea of God using suffering to train our souls and wake us up and pull us back to God. Lewis writes, no doubt pain as God's megaphone is a terrible instrument. It may lead to final and unrepentant rebellion, but it gives the only opportunity for the bad man for amendment. It removes the veil. It plants the flag of truth within the fortress of a rebel soul. Now, this is a Christian view, as we've seen, and liberal, moderate, conservative. But this view of God as a maker of souls is present in America now, during this pandemic. So we can use this second model to listen and interpret what certain Christians say. And what they say is about how God is using the pandemic to develop three traits in us: faith, virtue, and love. Okay, faith. According to John Hick and C.S. Lewis, God engages our free will, beckoning us to deepen our faith. Now, many religious persons believe God is doing just that. In a recent poll by the University of Chicago Divinity School and the Associated Press, 63% of American believers of all faiths and religions feel that during the pandemic, God is telling humanity to change how it lives. 63% of Americans. A Pew poll found that 26% of U.S. adults said that their faith has grown stronger during the pandemic. Only 1% said it had weakened. So 26% it grows, 1% it's diminished. Google did a study of its own records and has seen a 50% surge in people searching for prayer on their search engine across 95 countries, including the relatively secular countries of Northern Europe. Also, churches in the U.S. have reported booms in worship attendance virtually through Zoom, sometimes by a factor of 10. So the common element in all these statistics is this: the idea that during the pandemic, God is speaking to humanity to get it to change its ways, to shift its priorities. This is exactly the idea of a God who engages free will to shape human character. Significant Catholic leaders have presented this view. Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez says that God is not the cause of the pandemic, but God does permit it in order to draw the good out of it. And what is that good? It gives humans the opportunity to choose love or not to love. There are saints being made in our present crisis, says the Archbishop. Doctors and nurses, mothers and fathers, those who show the courage to love their neighbor. On March 27th, Pope Francis said the very same thing. The pandemic is not God's judgment on humanity, he said. It is God's call on people to change their lives. Praying on behalf of the people in the Vatican Square, Francis looked up to God and said, "This pandemic is not a time of your judgment, but of our judgment, a time to choose what matters and what passes away." Notice that fork in the road. It is a time to get our lives back on track with regard to you, Lord, and in relationship to others. Virtue. We have the opportunity not only to return to God in deeper faith, but also to shape our character and virtue. Christine Jeske, professor of cultural anthropology at Wheaton College, writes that the pandemic can wake us up to see how our methods for securing our identity as Americans do not make us happy. As Americans, we are what we do, she says. Our status is gained by productivity and consumption. We rely on ever-increasing capitalist growth, and yet we fear missing out. The pandemic, bringing our daily lives to a halt, may wake us up to an alternative way to live, one centered in tradition and relationships and our life with God, rather than in producing resumes, consumption, etc. Similarly, Mark Tranvik, a professor of Lutheran history and theology at Luther Seminary, believes that God is speaking and wants us to listen. The pandemic unmasks the great myth of our self-sufficiency and gives us an opportunity to shift our center of value to God. Third, love. The pandemic also provides us with an opportunity to change our society. We have the opportunity to live in solidarity and shared responsibility with our neighbor, Pope Francis says. But this view of the Pope is echoed across the board. Jeff Levin, an epidemiologist and observant Jew, has studied the relationship between religion and medicine. Just as John Hick described, so Levin has found that in pandemics, people are given opportunity to display acts of great generosity or acts of barbarity. They can show compassion and ethics and self-sacrifice, but they can also move to scapegoat minorities, as happened with the Jews during the Black Plague, and is happening today with Chinese immigrants and Asian Americans. minorities can be tagged as the objects of divine punishment. So, we've looked at the Christian versions of this second model of soul making, but this view that the pandemic gives us opportunities to grow is equally present in Judaism and Islam. Rabbi Joshua Kulik of Nashville writes this: "I don't see God in the plague. As we learn how the world works, we should know that every now and then, viruses coming from animals can mutate and infect human beings. That's not divine punishment, but the laws of nature. It's in the resilience and the tireless job of those who are trying to come up with a vaccine against this virus that I see God at work. I see God in the first responders who are risking everything for the sake of other human beings. For Rabbi Kulik, God is acting to inspire us towards empathy. God is growing souls. And we've already seen that 84% of American Muslims believe the pandemic provides a test from Allah to help them grow in their faith. Omar Ritchie of the Islamic Center of Southern California says that the virus is not only a test of faith, but a solidifying agent for our faith. He writes, "The Quran says trials will come and to be prepared for them. So how do we react? Do we go off and hoard toilet paper? Or do we take care of others?" God grows souls, and suffering provides opportunities for that growth.